Okay, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for being here today. We're for another fine seminar. Today, I'll be your host. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the United States. Before I announce the speaker today, I just have a couple of quick announcements. First off, want to thank Marlene Zook for a really fascinating talk last week. And a really excellent discussion that followed. You can see here at the website, you can see the link to her talk on YouTube. If you didn't get a chance to see it, it was really quite phenomenal and interesting. And next week, we have Peter Biederman, who will be talking about insect sociality and microbial management. So I look forward to that talk. For those of you who are attending for the first time, we welcome you to the FINE and glad you are joining us. The way the FINE works is we have about a 50-minute presentation by the speaker, and that's followed by a discussion that we basically allow to go as long as it needs to go or wants to go, up to about an hour. And during that discussion, what we do is we have people put question marks into the chat, and then as host, I'll relay those question marks to the speaker. If you're on YouTube, please write question marks or questions that you have into the chat there, and someone will relay that to me, and I'll relay those to the speaker for you. If you are on YouTube, please note that there is a bit of a delay, maybe upwards of a minute, so your question may not be directed in the moment that you ask it, but we'll definitely try and get those to the speaker for you. So this brings me to today's speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Sarah Guindre-Parker. Sarah is what we consider a rising star. She's an assistant professor at Kennesaw State University in Georgia in the United States. Her training started in her PhD was at Columbia University in the Rubenstein lab, where she worked in Kenya on the superb starling project, and continues to collaborate on that project into her postdoc and now as an assistant professor. Her postdoc work was a multi-university collaboration. She was based out of the University of Guelph in Canada and also University of Michigan, and she worked on a red squirrel project. She has recently established her lab at Kennesaw State, again in Georgia, where her research program, which involves largely undergraduate and master's level students, seeks to integrate across evolution, behavioral ecology, and endocrinology. And the main goal of her work is to try and understand how vertebrates, birds, and mammals respond to unpredictable environmental conditions, and sort of the adaptations that they have to survive those conditions. And she's been also, so that involves, using the data set from the Kenya project, but she's also started some work in the United States, looking at European starlings. She told me that that work is moving towards thinking about how urban gradients influence the fitness of individuals. And she actually was telling me that she has some interesting data that sort of counters what we might expect. And I won't go into the details. You're welcome to chat with her about that during the discussion or some other time. But lots of potentially interesting things coming out of her work in the United States now as well. Sarah's been productive in her early stage career. She has about 18 publications in really good journals. She's published a few times in American Naturalist and also journals like Biology Letters, so she's been quite productive. And her role as a professor has allowed her to really engage the community in her work. She works with K through 12 students. She involves people in her work locally, both here in the US and in Kenya. And she's also consulted on various documentaries, including one recently in the public broadcasting in the United States. Today, she's going to be giving a talk on her work, I believe, on the superb starlings. And the title of her talk is Ultimate and Proximate Benefits of Social Behavior in Superb Starlings. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah, and I hope you all enjoy the seminar today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my slides, so hopefully y'all can see my presentation slides. Good, I see a thumbs up. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to give one of the FIND seminars. This is a fantastic series. I've attended a bunch of them. So thank you so much for thinking of me to present my work. So in my lab, we think a lot about how animals cope with unpredictability in the environment. And I think this is especially an important topic in more recent times. And I wanted to highlight 2 of the 6 takeaways that the most recent IPCC report highlighted. And so one of them is that we're seeing that human-caused emissions are clearly causing extreme weather events. And we're also seeing an increase in weather whiplash, so altering extreme conditions. And for these reasons, I think it's really important as biologists that we try to understand why we're seeing, not only why we're seeing these increased extremes in environmental conditions, but how organisms respond to them. So the main question we try to tackle in my lab is, how do organisms cope with such unpredictable environmental challenges? And as the name suggests, the problem is that these challenges are unpredictable, so you cannot anticipate them, and therefore you can't really prepare for them. You usually have to respond kind of last minute when you realize that the environment has changed or the challenge is upon you. 2 of the main things that we like to think about are behavior and physiology as coping mechanisms. And that's because one individual is able to adjust their behavior and their physiology on short time scales when they do encounter such an unpredictable challenge. Today, I'm going to focus on some of my work on behavioral coping strategies and social behavior, especially in dealing with these unpredictable environments. So if we think about environmental unpredictability on a global scale, there are areas of the world that are less predictable or more variable. And so this is a map showing hotspots of variation in rainfall in red. So the redder areas highlight more variable or unpredictable regions. And across a couple of studies now, we found associations between environmental unpredictability and certain types of social behavior. So on the bottom figure now, I'm going to show you the incidence of cooperative breeding in birds specifically. And again, in red, we see hotspots of social behavior. And if you kind of squint and compare these 2 figures, you'll see that the hotspots of environmental unpredictability and the hotspots of cooperative breeding do coincide. And so on a global scale, we see this association between social behavior and unpredictable environments. This has been repeated in birds, now mammals, and even across human societies, and the likelihood that human societies cooperate with one another. And so while we see this pattern, it's less clear why exactly social behavior is beneficial in unpredictable environments. And one of my favorite hypotheses that tries to link the 2 is the Hardlife hypothesis. It suggests that social behavior can help animals during unpredictable, harsh conditions when they do occur. And so here I'm using social behavior really broadly, but I can give you a specific example. And so if you think about an organism that has helping at the nest or cooperative breeding, and they're trying to breed, and all of a sudden they happen upon a breeding season where the environment is really harsh and there's not a lot of food available in the environment, having helpers at the nest may allow the parents to find enough food if enough individuals are contributing to bringing food back for the young. And in that way, it can help them overcome those harsh environments. So that's one example of how a social behavior might help overcome harsh conditions. And so one prediction that we can make from this hypothesis is that the benefit of social behavior should be greatest under harsh conditions. So in this very theoretical figure, if we're thinking about the benefits of sociality on the y-axis across a gradient of different types of environments, we would then expect under harsh environments, the benefits would be greatest. And this has increasingly been looked at in a diversity of study systems. Here, I'm going to pick on bird examples, but basically we're seeing mixed results from empirical studies. So in some cases, the benefits of social behavior do appear to be greatest under harsh environments, but we also see cases where there's really no difference in benefits under harsh or favorable conditions, or some species show greater benefits of social behavior under favorable conditions alone. And so it's not really clear why that is. So in my research, I wanted to test the Hardlife hypothesis in one of my favorite social species, which is the superb starling pictured here. And this is work that I started as a PhD student at Columbia University. And I just wanted to highlight that my co-author on all this work is Dustin Rubenstein, who started the original population in 2006. So he started studying these birds. I really love studying them because they have really complex social lives, perhaps a little bit more complex than your average cooperatively breeding bird. And so these animals live in really large social groups of up to 60 individuals. The average is closer to 30, and they can get very small. I think the smallest group we've seen that seemed stable was about 15 birds. So there's lots of variability in group size, and they live in these huge societies. In addition to living in groups year-round, they also engage in cooperative breeding. So within any social group, there are plural cooperative breeder where multiple breeding pairs will attempt to reproduce in a given breeding season. And so that represents about a third of the social group. And then they'll receive help at their nest from both related and unrelated individuals in the social group. On average, about 1/6 of individuals in a social group will provide help. And so there's lots of variability in how many helpers individuals receive at their nest. It can range from 1 all the way up to a dozen. So there's lots of variability there. And so you may be wondering, that accounts for about half the group. So what goes on with the other half of the social group? Well, superb starlings allow a large proportion of the group to neither breed nor help in a given breeding season. And this is kind of neat. And so this group of non-breeding, non-helping birds can represent multiple things. It can represent breeders that are taking a break before coming back to breed in a future season. It can represent helpers that are taking a break and going to come back to helping in a future season. It can also possibly represent a stage where helpers have decided no longer to help and they're hoping or waiting for a future breeding opportunity. But the goal of this, this fact here is that over 50% of a social group doesn't actually engage in breeding or helping in any given breeding season. And that's quite a large proportion of the group, and that's a little bit atypical for cooperative breeding birds. What that means is that being in a bigger group doesn't necessarily mean that you get more helpers at the nest. And so in this system, we actually see a disconnect. At best, there's a very, very weak correlation between the size of your social group and the number of helpers at each nest. And on average, we often don't even see this correlation. And so being in a bigger group doesn't mean that you get more helpers. And so you can kind of dissociate the benefits of group living from the benefits of having helpers at the nest in the system a little bit more clearly than in other systems. So today I want to look at whether helping at the nest buffers these starlings from harsh environmental conditions, and whether group living similarly buffers individuals from harsh conditions. And so these starlings live in unpredictable savanna habitats. They have throughout their evolutionary history. And one of the main ways that their environment varies unpredictably is temporal variation in rainfall. So here, this figure is going to show you rainfall in millimeters across different months of the year, where we go from 1 to 12, being January to December. Each black line is going to show you the rainfall for one different year. And then the blue line is showing you the average across the couple decades that we've followed these starlings. I've highlighted at the top the different seasons that starlings tend to follow. So there are 2 rainy seasons where they tend to breed. And then during the drier periods in between the rainy seasons, we tend to call that the pre-breeding season or the non-breeding season. So they actually are able at times to squeeze in 2 breeding attempts in every year. The other way that their environment is variable, though not quite to the same extent, is that they do experience spatial variation in vegetation cover. And so they defend these pretty large territories as a social group. And then this figure is showing you the percentage grass cover on the y-axis across different years of our study. And this is a snapshot or a snippet. You'll notice that grass cover changes across different years, and that's correlated with rainfall. So years of high rainfall, all territories have higher grass cover. And then each line is representing the quality of a territory for one social group. And one thing to take away from this figure is that spatial variation is a lot more predictable. So some social groups always have a territory with more grass cover, and some social groups always have a territory with less grass cover. The main thing that these two things together shape in the life of a starling is that they influence the availability of insect prey. And that's the main food source for starling adults, but it's also the food source that they require in order to raise their young successfully. And so superb starlings are under extreme pressure to grow very quickly in the nest and fledge. There's really high nest predation rates in the savannas where they live. And so feeding young, high protein insect prey is really important so that they can survive to independence really quickly. So the work I'm going to share with you today was conducted at the Impala Research Center, which is located in central Kenya. And as part of this long-term study, we've monitored 9 social groups. This encompasses over 500 individuals that have been marked and monitored. This is over 15 years of data now, which means over 30 breeding seasons of data. And my last count was about 750 nesting attempts, and that's probably outdated already. And so this is a very large data set where we monitor not only individuals, but the breeding attempts undertaken in these social groups. We monitor breeding roles in every season and the outcome of these breeding attempts. And so if we're thinking about the benefits that helpers might provide at the nest, there are really 2 types of benefits that a breeder can gain. And it can be broken down into when their fitness will be increased. And it comes as a result of a classic life history trade-off called the cost of reproduction. So individuals, when they have resources, can allocate those to their current breeding attempt or can allocate it to themselves, which would favor their future reproductive success rather than their current reproductive success. When caring for young is really costly, we see a shift towards biparental care where 2 parents have to care for their young in order to be successful. And then in the case of cooperative species, we often see that the costs of caring for young are thought to be even higher. And so having helpers at the nest can be necessary, at least under certain conditions, so that you can successfully raise your young. But that means that there are 2 things that helpers can do to improve the fitness of a breeder. They can increase the current reproductive attempt by giving more food to the current young, or they can provide load lightening benefits where the breeders can do less work in raising their young so they can bring a little bit less food and therefore favor self-maintenance and future reproductive attempts. And so it's important to compare both of these benefits at the same time because in the absence of a current reproductive success benefit of having helpers, you may only see a future fitness benefit through load lightening. So you have to think about these at the same time. So I want to share with you some of our work on looking at the different benefits of helpers at the nest, whether they increase reproductive success of the current breeding attempt or they allow breeders to lighten their load and favor future fitness. And then testing the Hardlife hypothesis with both of these benefits. And before I go on, I have to tell you that there are really 2 things that superb starlings do to care for their young. One is that they spend some time perching near the nest, and we call that guarding behavior. We know it's guarding behavior because if a predator approaches the nest, they'll perform alarm calls, and then they'll contribute all to cooperatively mobbing a predator. And this is thought to be a really important behavior because nest predation is really high. The other behavior that they perform that's also really important, and I've mentioned before, is provisioning the young. So both helpers and breeders will bring food back to the nest to feed the young and raise them. So I'm going to start by sharing some of the reproductive success benefits that helpers can provide. And so this figure is going to show you the number of fledglings that survived to independence on the y-axis plotted against the number of helpers on the x-axis. And in all these figures, you'll notice the number of helpers is kind of like an index or a standardized score. And it's because I've controlled for how long we were able to observe the nest. And that's because nests that survive for a longer period and we observe them for longer periods, we tend to observe more helpers. So we do have to control for variability. If a nest fails really early, we're less likely to see more helpers. So this index simply controls for that fact. A higher score means more helpers. So 1 might be like the maximum close to a dozen helpers. And clearly what we can see from this figure is that there's a positive correlation where having more helpers increases the number of fledglings produced in the current reproductive attempt. So that's a clear benefit of having more helpers at your nest. When I tried to look at whether this relationship changed in years of favorable rainfall versus years of harsh rainfall, I found that helpers always increase reproductive success similarly, regardless of environmental conditions. And this was true when I looked at variability in rainfall as well as grass cover. So this does not support the Hardlife hypothesis that having helpers is most beneficial to overcome harsh conditions. Helpers always increase reproductive success similarly. I was interested in breaking this down into causes of nest failure. So when a nest wasn't successful, why that was. And so in starlings, we do monitor what happens when a nest fails. And here on the top figure, I'm going to show you the number of nestlings that were depredated or eaten. And then on the bottom panel, I'm going to show you the nestlings that were starved in the nest. So they probably didn't receive enough food. And the first takeaway is that there's really not a strong correlation between the number of helpers and either of these outcomes, but it does appear that there's a stronger correlation between the number of nestlings eaten by predators and having more helpers at the nest. So having more helpers can kind of decrease the likelihood of depredation. And that would suggest that nest guarding is a really important behavior because nest predation is the main source of failure in these starlings. It's not to say that provisioning the young is not important, but provisioning the young is probably likely to cause nest failure in a much smaller and narrower set of circumstances. And so you probably need to have few helpers in a bad year where there's not enough food and nest predation wasn't an issue for nestling starvation to occur. So then that would suggest that nest guarding behavior may be the most important factor in fledging more young. And this is work that an undergraduate student in my lab, Jasmine Little, just performed. And she did find that more so than provisioning, nest guarding behavior was the strongest predictor of the outcome at the nest. And so here, these figures are going to show you the total guarding performed at a nest on the x-axis. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to show you the likelihood that the nest fledged at least one offspring. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to show you the number of offspring that were fledged. And so you can see that both of these figures show the same relationship. There's an increase in your success, in your reproductive success, when there's more guarding performed at the nest. So guarding is really important. So this shows that helpers do increase reproductive success. That's one clear benefit of having helpers at the nest. But I didn't find any evidence for the Hardlife hypothesis because helpers did not increase reproductive success in conditions of harsh rainfall or on low quality territories. So next we can look at whether helpers provided load lightning and whether there were differences in the load lightning benefits across environment types. So when we think about load lightning, we would expect to see that individuals get to perform less work when they have more helpers at the nest. And I'm going to share with you slides with two figures. On the left-hand side, I'm always going to show you nest guarding on the y-axis, which is the percent of time a bird spent near the nest. And then on the right-hand side, I'm going to show you the provisioning rate, which is the number of trips where they brought food per hour. And so in a situation where we see load lightning, we would see that nest guarding or provisioning would decrease at nests that have more helpers. So the more helpers are present, the less work you get to do. And so we'll start with data for mom because mother starlings do perform the most work. And so we see that for nest guarding, there's really no correlation between the mom's behavior and the number of helpers that are present at her nest. But when we look at provisioning rate, we do see this load lightning benefit. So moms do less work when they have more helpers at their nest. We can look at the same thing for other individuals. So we can look at the father, which is the solid black line, or an individual helper, which is the dotted gray line. And really there's not a clear, there's no clear evidence that either of these groups benefits from load lightning, at least on this sort of average basis. So fathers and helpers individually perform less work than mom, and they don't seem to adjust their behavior very much according to the number of helpers that are present. So then if we think about the total amount of care that a nest is receiving across all of the individuals that are providing care for that nest, we can look at the cumulative behavior or the cumulative guarding and provisioning that nestlings are receiving. And this is that pale gray line towards the top. And so what we see is that when there are more helpers at a nest, the nest is being guarded a greater proportion of the time, and the nest is also receiving a higher provisioning rate. And so that suggests that mothers are experiencing incomplete load lightning And so the mother could theoretically decrease her provisioning rate even more as she had more and more helpers at her nest, so that the provisioning rate stayed the same regardless of the number of helpers that were present. But in this case, superb starling mothers appear to choose to still do a little bit more work than they technically need to, so that when there are more helpers, the provisioning rate overall continues to increase. So now that we see, at least in some cases, there's this load lightning benefit of having helpers, we can ask whether that benefit is greater in harsh environments relative to favorable conditions. And if that were the case, we would expect that in harsh years, which I'm representing here as the sort of gray line, you would see greater load lightning, or that steeper, more negative slope between offspring care behavior and the number of helpers. And that in favorable environments, which is represented by the black line here, you would see a more shallow slope, or you wouldn't see as big of an effect. And so for moms, we actually don't find any evidence for the Hardlife hypothesis, where they benefit from load lightning most under years of low rainfall. We actually didn't find any interaction between environmental conditions and the number of helpers on a mom's behavior. So they experience load lightning regardless of rainfall and regardless of territory quality. When we look at fathers, we do find an interaction between the number of helpers and environmental conditions on the behavior that they're performing at the nest, but in a different direction than we expected. So while we expected that harsh years should lead to more load lightning, so a more negative slope, we actually found that fathers tended to increase their nest guarding and increase their provisioning rate in harsh years when they had more helpers. And in contrast, in years of favorable rainfall, fathers were more likely to experience load lightning and decrease their nest guarding or decrease their provisioning rate ever so slightly when they had more helpers. And so this is kind of a wacky pattern. It's the opposite that we predicted from the Hardlife hypothesis. And one possible explanation for this pattern is that fathers are committed to providing more care under harsh conditions only when they think their nest is going to be successful, and otherwise they choose not to invest very much. So they're more likely to provide more offspring care when there are more helpers at the nest, because that was an important predictor of whether a nest was going to be successful or not. So we do find that helpers provide load lightning benefits in superb starlings for both the mothers and the fathers, though under different contexts. But under no circumstances did we find evidence that the benefits of load lightning were greatest under harsh environmental conditions. So once again, we don't find support for the Hardlife hypothesis in this specific case. So these are some of the benefits that starlings gain from caring for their young, but the flip side of that is that individuals can pay costs of caring for young. And a number of things led me to believe that starlings would pay costs of caring for their young. One is that they experience load lightning. So when they get more help, they bother to reduce the amount of work that they do. So there must be a benefit to doing less work. And we also see birds taking a lot of time off. So I expected that looking at all of the variation in parental care that we see, some mothers, for example, work really hard. Some mothers barely provision their young at all. So we would expect to see a cost of caring for young that would be proportional to how hard individuals are working, regardless of whether they're breeders or helpers. So in looking for a cost of offspring care, I wanted to characterize a couple of different physiological systems that have been linked to this cost of reproduction in other species, including other birds and other cooperative breeders. And so I measured a couple different traits, and I won't go into explaining them at this point in the presentation, but if you want to talk more about them during the Q&A, I'm happy to. I measured a couple different indices of glucocorticoid physiology, so including baseline glucocorticoids and the stress response. I looked at oxidative stress and the imbalance between harmful reactive oxygen species and neutralizing antioxidants. I looked at bacteria killing ability, which is a general measure of immune function. I looked at body condition. So in case you're wondering, this is a bird being weighed in a little container. And then I also looked at differences in the prevalence of bloodborne pathogens, including avian malaria. And what I predicted was that parents or helpers that provided more offspring care and worked harder would decline in their physiological condition over the course of one breeding attempt. So you should see that if you work harder, you decline more in physiological state. And I'm going to sort of commit a cardinal sin and show you a ton of tiny figures only for a brief second. But the point is to say, no, we didn't find that starlings paid any physiological cost of caring for young, regardless of whether we were looking at breeders or helpers, and regardless of whether we were thinking about guarding behavior or provisioning behavior. And so none of the indices that I've measured that were physiological costs of reproduction associated in other systems appeared to be applicable for superb starlings. So this puzzled me because there's lots of variation. And like I said, we expect that there's a cost of raising young and of helping raise young. And so it was a little bit odd that these starlings appear to avoid all costs of caring for young. What I did find is that individuals provided more care if they were in better physiological condition prior to chick hatching. And so this is an example of what I mean. In this figure, I'm showing you nest guarding behavior. And then on the x-axis, I'm showing you the baseline glucocorticoid concentrations of an individual bird during incubation. So when the chicks hadn't yet hatched. So they hadn't provided any of this offspring care yet. And so you can see that individuals that had higher baseline glucocorticoids just prior to breeding were more likely to guard the nest a greater proportion of their time later. And so this suggests that these starlings don't pay a cost of reproduction, and yet they still gain all these benefits of fledging more chicks. And so it made me wonder whether my study was just missing something or whether these starlings were actually able to avoid a cost of reproduction. So to test this, I wanted to compare physiology in superb starlings, which are this sort of cooperative species, to a close relative that doesn't breed cooperatively. And so I used the greater blue-eared starling as my comparative species, and they're a pair breeder, so only mom and dad will raise their young. They're otherwise very closely related to the superb starling, and they have very similar life histories. And so they lay the same number of eggs and raise the same number of young. They provision their young with the same prey, and they guard the nest similarly. And they breed at the same time in the same place, and they sometimes overlap entirely in their territories. So they experience identical environmental conditions. The main difference is that the greater blue-eared starling is pair breeding, and the superb starling is cooperatively breeding. And so I repeated this, looking for a cost of caring for young in both species. And here I'm going to show you one example of a cost of caring for young, which is accumulating oxidative damage on the y-axis. And I'm going to compare the physiology of individuals when they were at the incubation stage, so they hadn't yet provided offspring care, and then during chick rearing when they had started providing offspring care. And I'm showing you data for mom and dad separately here, but you can see that in both parents of the non-cooperative species of starling, there is an oxidative cost associated with caring for young. And so individuals do increase in their oxidative damage with this, which is this physiological cost, over the course of a single breeding attempt. So we do find that caring for young is costly, at least in pair breeding species. And then when I repeat this for the superb starling, once again, there's no evidence for a cost of reproduction in this species, regardless of what breeding role you're looking at. So I've broken it down for fathers and mothers, for helpers that only guard, and then for helpers that guard and provision the young. And again, there's no evidence that starlings pay a cost of reproduction over one breeding attempt. So this perhaps is not surprising when we break it down and look at the workload of one individual species of one individual of the non-cooperative species and one individual of the cooperative species. And the takeaway really is that even the hardest working superb starling individual does very little work compared to other species of pair breeding birds. So this graph is just showing you the provisioning rate on average for one non-cooperative individual versus a cooperative individual, and you can see it's nearly a twofold difference. And so these non-cooperative starlings might have less flexibility in offspring care. So mom and dad don't get to lighten their load at any point. They have to share care and they have to provision their young enough. And they do pay a physiological cost of breeding associated with providing that parental care in that environment. And superb starlings appear to avoid paying any cost of physiological cost of offspring care. And so sociality may be this mechanism that provides them with flexibility to adjust how much work they do. And in that way, one of the main benefits of having helpers at the nest can be providing flexibility. So individuals of the superb starling species get to tailor the amount of work they do based on the social environment. So how many helpers they have at the given nest where they're working. I didn't get to share this, but they also adjust their behavior according to rainfall. So they show plasticity in their offspring care behavior based on rainfall, and they tend to do more work when there's more rainfall. So they invest more in offspring care when times are good. They also get to adjust their offspring care based on their own physiological condition just prior to breeding. And so all of these things mean that starlings can probably make really optimized decisions for themselves as an individual and decide when they want to provide care in a way that is not very costly for them. And so when we're thinking about the Hardlife hypothesis, none of the results I've shared on helping at the nest seems to support the idea that the benefits of helpers are greatest under harsh conditions. So none of the data that I shared found any support for the Hardlife hypothesis for the cooperative breeding part of the equation. But starlings also live in these large social groups. And so these are year-round groups. They're much bigger than what's needed for cooperative care at the nest alone. And so we can ask whether they gain independent benefits of group living and whether those benefits are greater under harsh environmental conditions. So I've already mentioned that they live in big social groups, but one thing I didn't explain super clearly is that these groups are actually mixed kin groups. So they're not family groups where everyone is related to one another. Their large social groups comprise a large proportion of immigrants. And part of that is that they have low recruitment of young into their social group because they just have a low reproductive rate and a high predation rate at their nests. We find that about 90% of females will disperse from their social group and recruit into another group where they'll live their whole lives and try to breed. And even though males are the philopatric sex that are more likely to remain in their natal group, about 60% of males can still disperse. And so that means about 60% of males are immigrants. They'll disperse into a new social group and then live and breed in that new social group for the rest of their lives. And so that means that kin relations can explain very little of the benefits of group living in superb starlings because there's actually very little relatedness. There's some substructure within a social group, but it's much lower than you would expect. The other thing that's cool about this group is that about half of the individuals take breaks where they don't breed and they don't help. And the don't help part is the part that puzzles me. And so individuals are not just exchanging favors. Individuals who are unrelated are allowed to recruit into a group and they don't have to help, it would seem. And so that suggests that inclusive fitness theory can not explain most of the benefits of group living for our starlings. So an alternative, a direct benefit that starlings could gain from being in a larger group is that larger group sizes could improve the survivorship of adults. So there could be some fitness benefit of being in a bigger group. And so in this sort of theoretical example, if we were thinking about how survivorship would change over time, we would expect that survivorship would remain higher for individuals in a large group, and survivorship would be a little bit lower for animals in a small group. And in this case, that's the dotted line. If we want to layer on the Hardlife hypothesis onto this and make a prediction, we would expect then that the benefit of being in a bigger group relative to a small one would be greater under years of harsh environmental conditions. And in good years or under good conditions, the benefit of being in a big versus small group might be smaller. So the difference in survivorship may be reduced across different social groups. So to test this, I looked at males and females separately because there are some differences in phylopatry across the sexes. And so here I'm going to show you a survivorship plot where survival probability is on the y-axis, and 1 is that all of our birds are alive. And over time on the x-axis, you'll see that the survivorship curves start to decline. That's how aging works. That's normal. And then I've grouped individuals based on the size of their social group. And so in the black line, the sort of thick line, we're looking at individuals from the largest social groups. The intermediate gray line is going to show you individuals in the average size social groups. And then the pale gray line at the bottom is going to show you individuals in the smallest social groups. And so what this figure is showing you is that there's a clear benefit of being in a bigger group where individuals live longer lifespans if they're in the largest social group relative to the smallest social group. So that's a clear benefit of group living. And while I tested for the Hardlife hypothesis, as I always do, larger groups always increase survivorship in females, regardless of the quality of the environment, including both rainfall and grass cover. So there was no evidence that the Hardlife hypothesis was supported for the benefit of group living. We can repeat the same analysis in our male starlings. And once again, I found the same pattern where males in the largest social groups had higher survivorship relative to males in the smallest social groups. And so again, that's a clear benefit of living in a bigger group. However, when we map on environmental variability here, we find the opposite pattern that we expected. And so the benefit of being in a bigger group was only apparent in years of high rainfall. If we looked in years of low rainfall or average years, there was really no difference in survivorship according to group size. So none of those survivorship curves on the left-hand side and the middle panel are different from one another. They're all overlapping in their confidence intervals. And so again, this is the opposite pattern that we expect from the Hardlife hypothesis. One possible explanation for this is that there might be internal conflict for males within a social group, and that conflict may be accentuated in harsh years. And so the benefits of being in a bigger group kind of cancel out with greater conflict of being in a bigger group under harsh conditions. And so those benefits are only really felt under years of favorable rainfall. So overall, these superior starlings certainly benefit from living in larger groups, but they do not appear to benefit most under harsh environmental conditions. And so once again, we failed to find support for the Hardlife hypothesis in this system. But we might still ask ourselves, what is it about being in a larger group that improves the lifespan of these birds? And there's really three main hypotheses that could explain this. One is that being in a bigger group improves foraging success. That's why they live longer. The second is that being in a bigger group improves the health or condition of individuals in that group. And then the third is that being in a bigger group reduces predation risk of adults, and therefore that increases their lifespan. I'm going to warn you, I don't have great data to test or differentiate across all of these hypotheses, but I have some ideas, so I can share some of those now. So in our survivorship models, the two variables that we know to shape food availability in our starlings, grass cover and rainfall, were not correlated to survival in any way for males or females. And so in that way, we do not think that being in a bigger group allows individuals to get more food. Superb starlings also forage off territory a lot of the time. So even if you have a high quality territory and you're in a big group, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're only relying on that territory for your feeding. The second hypothesis is that being in a bigger group will increase your individual condition. There can be sort of like stress buffering effects of being in a bigger group, and we actually don't find that at all. In fact, we find that individuals in a larger group tend to be in slightly worse condition than individuals in smaller intermediate groups. So this is just one example where I'm showing you antioxidant capacity, and so higher levels would be better. And you can see that in the largest social groups, antioxidant capacity starts to decline a little bit. We have similar findings for glucocorticoids as well. So being in a bigger group does not improve the physiological condition of individuals in that group. And then finally, the third hypothesis is that in a bigger group, individuals benefit from protection from predators. And again, we don't have great observations of adult predation because it's pretty difficult to observe in the field. What we do have more information about is predation risk at the nest. And Dustin in 2006 performed some predator model experiments with goshawks, which are a predator of both nests, but also adults. And he found that all group members contribute to mobbing predators, including the breeders and helpers, but more importantly, including those non-breeder, non-helper group members. And so if you live in a larger social group, you have access to a greater pool of individuals that would come mob a predator with you if you alarm call. And so for that reason, we do think that being in a bigger group does probably reduce predation risk. So the first hypothesis that group size improves access to foraging is probably not supported. There's probably some link between the individual condition of an animal and their group size, but perhaps not in the positive correlation that we predicted. And then there's possible support for reduced predation risk in a larger group. So group living does provide fitness benefits that may favor these large mixed-kin social groups that we see in superb starlings. And if you're interested in knowing more about what causes a specific male to live in his natal group versus disperse, I really recommend you check out Shaylee Shaw's work. She just finished her PhD at Columbia, and she dug deep into some of these alternative reproductive tactics and what makes a male most successful under what type of conditions. So she knows lots more about that than I do. Okay, and so overall, there are other coping strategies for living in unpredictable environments, and I want to touch really quickly on some physiological mechanisms that may be beneficial. And so when we think about how animals integrate information about the challenges in their environments and how they adjust their phenotypes in accordance, glucocorticoids are one popular mechanism because it's a pleiotropic hormone that influences behavior and physiology and morphology, and it responds to changes in a variety of environmental factors and conditions that animals might face. And so the circulating glucocorticoids in the systems of all vertebrates are controlled by the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and it's through a variety, a cascade of hormones that talk to the adrenals and control the glucocorticoids circulating in the body according to the stressors that animals are facing. And so this hormone is really famous for the stress response. Glucocorticoids are typically quite low in the body, and then animals mount a stress response when they face a stressor, and it helps them adjust their behavior and physiology in order to overcome that stressor. And as a researcher, I can trick animals into producing a stress response using an ACTH injection, and that's just another hormone that the brain uses to communicate with the adrenal cortex. And so I can use these hormone injections to measure the responsiveness of the HPA axis and assess the stress response in these animals. So I wanted to test the idea that animals from unpredictable environments would mount stronger stress responses because they encounter more unpredictable stressors. So if we were going to measure the stress response in a predictable habitat and that from an animal in an unpredictable habitat, the magnitude of the stress response would be greater in the unpredictable habitat. And so to do this, you need to compare populations that experience differences in the predictability of the environment over long periods of time. And so to do this, I used a comparative study where I traveled across 8 sites in Kenya, where dispersal across sites was really unlikely to happen for superb starlings. And these sites differed pretty drastically in the predictability of the rainfall that they receive. And so here, this figure on the right is going to show you monthly precipitation for the 8 sites that I selected. And each black line is showing you rainfall for 1 year. And you can kind of tell which sites are more predictable or unpredictable based on how the lines overlap with one another. So an example of a predictable site would be where all the rainfall years across multiple decades overlap with each other pretty tightly. And so you can kind of know when to expect high rainfall versus low rainfall. An example of an unpredictable site would be on the bottom row at Talik. And there you'll notice none of the lines overlap with one another. So in any given month of the year, you probably can't guess how much rainfall you'll experience. And that's probably the experience of a superb starling as well. And so when I traveled across these populations and I used this hormone injection protocol in order to look at the stress response that they mount, I did find that there was a correlation between the responsiveness of the HPA axis, which is on the y-axis here, and the predictability of the environment, which is on the x-axis. And what you need to know is that more unpredictable environments are those lower values of constancy, and they're associated with animals that mount stronger stress responses in response to that injection. And so we do find, like we expected, that starlings from unpredictable sites have a more responsive HPA axis and mount a stronger stress response to that injection. And what's cool about this study is that the environmental characteristics that best predicted the HPA axis across populations were over multiple decades. And that's much longer than the lifespan of one individual starling. And so that suggests that environmental predictability in rainfall has been a source of selection that shaped the HPA axis across these populations. One thing I'll note is that I'm certain across this gradient that there's really cool variation in social behavior. I think that there are differences in group size across sites. And so I don't have a lot of data or evidence to support what kind of link there might be between the HPA axis and social behavior. And I think that would be a really exciting avenue for future work. So overall, today I shared with you some of my work on these starlings, showing that they clearly benefit from having helpers at the nest, and they also clearly benefit from living in larger groups. But I did not find any support for the harsh life hypothesis because none of these benefits were greater under harsh conditions. If anything, I found that females always benefited similarly across all environments, and males tended to benefit most under favorable conditions rather than unfavorable ones. And so it suggests that perhaps the hard life hypothesis can be built upon to think about other types of environments that might favor benefits of social behavior. One that doesn't quite capture what we find here is the temporal variability hypothesis that Rubenstein and Levet proposed in 2007. And it suggests that sociality not only increases fitness under harsh conditions, but it can also provide benefits under favorable conditions. And I would suggest that the superb starling system actually supports something a little different than this, which is that starlings' social behavior allows them to take advantage of favorable conditions when they do occur. And so just like harsh conditions are unpredictable, so are the favorable conditions when they can get boosts in their fitness. And so that might be what social behavior, what benefits starlings gain from social behavior most. The other thing about these starlings is that they have loads of flexibility from their social behavior that allows them to forego costs of raising young that are typical for other species, even in the same environments. And so they get to keep their workloads rather low because they can skip breeding seasons or helping seasons. They can adjust how much work they do according to the other contributions at the nest. They can adjust how much work they do according to how favorable the environment is or according to their own physiological condition. And all of that provides them with flexibility so that they can probably avoid costs that other individuals are not able to avoid. And so with that, I'll just thank the two co-authors for the work that I presented today, all of the folks that contributed to data collection over the years, and then also the sources of funding that funded this long-term project and all of the work that I did. And so that's all I had. So should I stop sharing my screen, Lauren?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for that wonderful talk. So lots to think about. And so now we have an opportunity to ask questions, talk with Sarah about her work. If you have a question, please type a question mark in the chat and I'll relay, I'll tell her, I'll watch that cue and relay that to her. And we try to encourage, the students in the crowd to ask questions too. We really want you to have an opportunity to engage with scientists in the find. So I will be looking for people we don't hear from as much as well. But to get started, again, thank you, Sarah. To get started, I'm going to turn it over to Karsten, who has a question.
Yes, thank you for really a great and fascinating talk. This system is so amazing and it raises many, many questions, and you had many answers. I had written down one question which you addressed at the very end of your presentation, but I did not really get your point. This is there's little evidence for the harsh life hypothesis in these starlings. And I think it was Cornwallis and Rubenstein who had this other paper showing that this kind of cooperative breeding might evolve in benign environments, and then these species move into harsh environments and succeed there. And I didn't get, you then said, but your data doesn't fully support this because the good conditions are as unpredictable as are the harsh conditions in the environment. Can you explain this a bit more for me to understand, please?
Yeah. So the rainfall is really fluctuating a lot across years and across months in the system. And so there's basically a large range of how much rainfall can occur in a breeding season, and it's almost like a continuous range. It's not just there are occasional droughts and otherwise things are pretty good. And so what I suggested was that under years of extra high rainfall, when there's lots of resources and like finding food is probably really, really easy, those conditions are just as unpredictable, because that's like one extreme environment. They're just as unpredictable as like the harsh environments when there's not a lot of rainfall. So the variability in rainfall is fairly continuous in this system, which is why I suggested that's a possibility.
Okay, but do you mean this, you expect they did not evolve in a benign environment, or do you mean this is the reason why they're successful in the harsh environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So starlings superb starlings throughout much of their evolutionary histories have probably existed in unpredictable environments in some capacity. And so it would be a broader evolutionary question as to what their what type of environment their specific ancestor faced. So I think this species has lived in unpredictable environments for a really long time. And I'd have to go back to the specific Cornwallis paper you're suggesting to see if there were more details about like what the state of the ancestor would have been. But I suspect that, yeah, it's not clear to me that superb starlings' social behavior evolved for coping with environmental unpredictability necessarily, like you say. It might have been something that arose under more benign conditions in an ancestor, and then it just facilitated movement to harsh environments or unpredictable environments.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good question.
Okay, so our next question comes from Maren.
So my name is Maren Hook. I'm from the University of Derby. Thanks for the talk, and I'm interested in helping behavior in general, and the question is obviously, if there's little kin and if half of the population aren't, or of a group are not helping, why is not everybody breeding, and why, if somebody is not breeding, why do they help? So if they're not related, what's in for the helpers and what's in for not breeding?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I won't have a very satisfying answer, but we think that there's probably like dominance hierarchy, probably in males and females, and there's probably conflict over who's allowed to do what. We just don't have a lot of observations over that conflict and over who gets to make those decisions at the social group level. I think that a lot of breeders take time off in order to mitigate those costs. So I think that even an individual in a pretty dominant position may choose to be this non-breeder, non-helper in a given season because they feel that if they try to breed again, it may be costly. And so they take time off, if that makes sense. Likewise, there's not a ton of cost to being a helper. And so perhaps helping is okay every once in a while, and you get to take time off. You don't face a large physiological cost. Exactly when you would decide to help and why is not as clear. There are cases, of course, where there are sort of like a kin substructure within the group. So there are cases where you can get indirect benefits. I certainly didn't mean to say that was never the case where that would happen. But it can't be the full explanation, because you also see these unrelated birds helping, and whether helping like is more likely to gain you a breeding position in the future or to help you in your dominance hierarchy and climbing that hierarchy, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is posted by someone who had to leave. His name is Max Verhey. And he says, thank you for an awesome presentation. I was wondering why you chose to study this subject in the species. From your introduction, it seems to me like the topic is already quite thoroughly studied. So what would your findings add to the overall literature? And he says, I'm asking this because I'm often wondered how to justify studying systems that already receive quite a bit of attention in new species.
So I'm going to interpret the question to be like, picking a new social species that nobody studied before and like studying that versus studying an established system that somebody's got some groundwork on. And I guess the answer is that there's like a trade-off between having to discover everything about a specific species. A lot of species social systems are very poorly described, as many people in this group know. And so you're sort of starting from scratch if you decide to pick something that's not been done before. Whereas if you start with a system that has a little bit of at least a couple of years of data, where we do have an idea, you can actually build a little bit more complex hypotheses. So I would suggest that you probably need at least a decade of data to do some of the analyses that I was doing, looking at how fluctuations in the environment would shape benefits. And it wouldn't have been possible to do that in a study where you only had like 3 or 4 years of data, because you may not capture quite as much environmental variation in that time frame to do those analyses. And so it made sense for me to start working in a system that did have some preliminary or quite a bit of information existing already, where I could ask slightly more complex questions. So that's what made sense to me. And it's too bad the person has hopped off, is what you were saying, because maybe they could clarify if I address their question.
Yeah, they've left, but I think that was sort of my interpretation as well, what they were looking for.
Yeah.
Your answer makes total sense to me. I made similar decisions 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question is from Vashuda Kilcarney. Did I say that correctly?
Hi. Yeah, my name is Vasudha, and I'm an undergraduate at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, ISER, in India. So my question, Marin asked it, but I have another one. Do you think diseases play an important role in regulating the size of these social structures? And do you think that comes into place, disease and social immunity, the costs and benefits of that? Do you think that plays a role?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whether sort of disease dynamics come into play in this social system. And the answer is that I don't have a ton of data, but of the few things that I looked at related to sort of infection or immunity, I didn't find that animals were more likely to have like bloodborne pathogens like avian malaria if they were in a bigger group compared to a smaller one. I looked at only a tiny number of possible diseases or parasites that they could have. So it's not to say that that's not a possibility, but what I did look at, I didn't find any evidence in that direction. And there was also no correlation between like immune measures, immune parameters that I looked at and group size either. So I'm not certain. I will say that starlings, as far as a social group, don't necessarily all hang out in like tiny spaces together. They'll of course visit the nest, but not the whole social, like even though they live in up to 60 individuals within a group, not all 60 will go to the same nest, for example. So even though they are a social group that's sort of stable over long periods of time, they don't actually necessarily interact with each other on a daily basis. And like some other social species may interact with a lot more individuals in closer proximity. So I'm not certain how disease dynamics would come into play with this social, like as a social cost, but I haven't found any strong support that it does as of yet.
That makes sense. Thank you. I also really like your slides.
Thanks.
Okay, our next question comes from Kaya.
Hi, Sarah. Good job. And it's been so cool to watch as you've sort of placed one piece of the puzzle after another and added to the big picture. It's so cool. I have I guess another angle at the question, or the sort of big picture that is emerging, is that you have a case of high social tolerance to explain, where there's just so many in the group that don't do much until, I guess, an acute case of like a predator approaching comes along, which, you know, might be a big deal, but still you know, in general, don't do very much. And do you see any evidence of there being just a relatively lower cost of increasing group size for these starlings compared to closely related pairs?
Can you repeat the very last bit? Sorry.
Yeah. sorry for the background noise. Do you see any evidence of a relatively lower increase in the cost of increasing group size in these sort of cooperatively breeding starlings compared to closely related pair breeders, to explain the sort of high social tolerance?
So the cost of increasing group size being lower for the social species relative to like a pair breeding species, you're suggesting? That's a good question. At least the pair breeding species that I studied didn't form social groups. So they only would form breeding pairs during the breeding season. So I'm not sure that I have thought about that in the starling system specifically. But they do have a lot of sort of tolerance, as you suggest, and you kind of have to. And the only reason that I have to justify that is because they gain a clear benefit from tolerating more immigrants arriving into their social group. There's a clear like fitness benefit for the adults to doing that. And then without that, I wouldn't know how to explain why the group is so large if so many of them choose not to help. And I think that the group size is being driven not only by helpers at the nest, but by the benefits of group living being different from the benefits of helpers at the nest.
Okay, so next question is from Zulema.
Yeah. Hi, Sarah. I really enjoyed your talk a lot. I'm Zulema Tang Martinez, University of Missouri, St. Louis. I'm retired. I guess I have a couple of questions and I had to step away for a few minutes. So it's possible that you answer this. And if so, I apologize. But I was wondering whether in harsher years, you get a greater proportion of helpers, so that rather than having, you showed, I think it was 16% at the beginning, whether you get any sort of increase in the number of helpers at that point, whether you get a decrease in the number of breeders in the group. And then the second question was whether you have any idea of I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. What influences or what affects the decision of an individual bird to help or not help, and also how they make the choice if they are going to help, of which breeding pair to help? And do the breeding pairs have any influence on this? So I hope that's clear.
Yeah. So I'll try to tackle the first part of your question. Oh no, I just forgot what it was. So I'll start with the second part then. And then you can remind me of the first part. So I don't have a great sense of exactly when an individual would decide to help, other than the factors that I suggested were important in my talk. So like your own physiological status would be an important decision criteria, the quality of the environment. So if it happens to be breeding season and you notice there's not that much rainfall, that seems to be important. How many other individuals are present at a nest and helping at a nest would also influence the likelihood that you would do more versus less work. Beyond those things, I don't know. I don't have a great sense of like the contribution that helpers may impose on, or that breeders may impose on helpers to, like, we don't really know whether there's like coercion in forcing individuals to help. We do know if there are kin relationships, I think that that's one obvious thing that can dictate whether you help at the nest of a relative versus if there's no relative available, then I don't know how they select which breeder they may want to help. So I don't have a perfect answer to your question. And I remembered the second part, which was the proportion of breeders and helpers across different years. Okay. And so we do know that there are more breeding pairs in more favorable years. And my impression is that there are also a larger proportion of the group will also help when there are more breeding pairs. But beyond that, I have not tried to disentangle how rainfall specifically influences the proportion of helpers in a social group. And I'm wondering if that's something that, and I don't think she's on this call, but I think Shaylee Shaw may have looked at that more specifically in her more recent PhD work, but that's not something I remember looking at specifically.
Okay, thanks.
Karsten, you have another question?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to ask another question, though it's maybe a bit of an unfair one, more out of interest. I mean, you've shown that there seems to be no costs of reproduction. You showed all these slides. In these slides, you didn't differentiate between mothers, fathers, and helpers, but I guess it's for all these categories the same. So then for me, the question is, why do especially the breeding females not increase their reproductive investment such that there would be, of course? So is there some constraints that they cannot, because of course they have the cost of aging, the probability to survive reduces with age. So why can they not lay more eggs so that they come into this, what we would expect from all other species, that there would be costs of reproduction?
That's a good question. And I'll say in my analyses, I wasn't able to look at like females that were like older or later in life, which may make different investment decisions than like a younger female who's at the beginning of her breeding career. And that's absolutely something that we could see. And like I said, so it's both a really cool feature of the superb starlings, and it's also a little bit of a research constraint that they take a lot of time off. And so it means that if you're monitoring an animal, you really need like 15 years of data before you can really see what they do early on in between the time off versus later on in their life. And so we may be able to go back and try to tease that out at this stage. When I was first starting my PhD, it seemed probably not super feasible based on how much data there existed at the time. So it is possible that as they age, starlings are making different investment decisions. The main reason that I can think of to explain differences in load lightening strategies for males and females is that mom just does more work to begin with. And so maybe she's already doing the most amount of provisioning. And so maybe increasing her provisioning if she has more helpers or the year is more favorable is already difficult, whereas the father is able to increase his amount of work when conditions are favorable because he doesn't do very much to begin with. They have much lower provisioning rates. So that might be the only explanation I could provide for why we see different load lightening strategies in males and females.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question comes from Adriana.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much for such a nice talk. I really enjoyed it. Adriana Maldonado from Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. And my question probably is a little bit more technical. I'm really puzzled that you didn't really find that much support for the Hardlife hypothesis. And I'm wondering, how did you define unpredictable environments versus harsh environments? And why we would expect to have a benefit of social group living in harsh environments? Like, I understand it in terms of unpredictability, but then in harsh environments, we would expect to have like a negative effect on group size, right? Like competition increases and everything. So how did you define both of those? And did you test only for harsh environments when you were testing for the Hardlife hypothesis? Or did you use the unpredictability?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so the predictability of a site or the predictability of an environment is a long-term feature based on the pattern of variation in conditions at that site. So that's like a site-specific characteristic. So you can't look necessarily at like in one individual starling if they behave differently in an unpredictable time versus a more predictable time, or you could if you like, I don't know, if you compress time and you did it in a captive setting or something like that. But in these starlings, the Impala Research Center where we study them is thought to be a pretty unpredictable site. And that would be a characteristic when you compare other habitats or other sites. So they just happen to live in an unpredictable site. Within that unpredictable site, rainfall varies through time. And so what I did for the given data set that we had is I would look at the mean and plus or minus one standard deviation of the mean of of the typical experience of a starling, and that would be the average environment. And then a favorable environment would be like more than 1 standard deviation away from that average, the average conditions. And then the harsh conditions would be more than 1 standard deviation rainfall less than that average set of conditions. So that's kind of how I define. So they're kind of like the more extremes that they still would face a couple times in their lives.
Then can I ask there a second question? Well, we know that extremes are not good either. Like if we have a lot of rainfall, that also harms the environment. So wouldn't it be that the harsh environments, like it's defined by those extreme events, like very hard or very high rainfall and very low rainfall? Both will be considered like harsh environments, and then probably something in between those 1 standard deviations are favorable environments. Well, maybe something to think about.
No, that's a good question. So I guess like from the point of view of a superb starling, if I was thinking of like what point would you get too much rainfall, I would guess that would be the point where like larvae would drown and you wouldn't find insects emerging in your environment anymore or something like that. Like it would be too much rainfall that wouldn't lead to food availability or something like that. And I don't think that we typically see that in the system, and probably because they have wet, dry seasons. Twice a year, they fluctuate between dry and wet conditions. And so maybe like because of the nature of the environment, it just doesn't get that wet that there would be less food. We likewise they don't nest so low to the ground that like flooding. I mean, we don't really see the environment flood or anything, but we wouldn't see like nests flooding when there's too much rainfall or anything like that. Yeah, that's an interesting point though, that is there a situation where they would have too much rainfall? And I don't think that I have thought of a situation that would be too much, but I guess it could happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So we have plenty of time for more questions. I'm going to skip myself and go to Miles and let him ask a question here.
Hi, thank you. Miles Muczynski from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I work in Lauren's lab studying the degus in Chile. I am, just to be completely transparent, working on a couple of different things right now, so I'm in and out of this conversation, but something that Adriana had just asked kind of brought me back in. And I wanted to ask, I think leaning into what she's discussing with both the favorable, which is one extreme with more of abundance or greater measures of rain and greater access to certain resources, or the harsh conditions, wouldn't either one of those extremes become unfavorable given if the starlings are normally experiencing unpredictable environments or unpredictable conditions? The way I think of this is that even if it is a season where there is an abundance of rain or abundance of resources, that could become unfavorable if it's priming offspring for those types of conditions. And under the situation of unpredictability, the next season or some sort of subsequent following period when the offspring may be reproducing or during some sort of critical time, it may not align with that. And so I guess what I'm saying here is, do you have any more thoughts on that? And can you also remind me if you did say that the starlings are experiencing those unpredictable changes?
So the starlings for the long-term study site are in a site that we would characterize as fairly unpredictable because it does fluctuate a lot. So, and they can live, so on average, a starling probably lives like 8 years. They can live up to, I think, 15 or 16 years. So it's very likely that they'll experience a lot of fluctuations within their lifespan, regardless of what the conditions when they're born are. So other folks in the system, including Dustin, have worked on like priming effects and maternal effects. So depending on the quality of the year where you're born, that can program certain differences in your strategy. That's not something I looked a ton of at myself. And then I will just say, though, that generally speaking, because they live so long and because they're likely to experience both extremes in their lifespan, you wouldn't expect a strict programming strategy where, you know, you would expect only favorable conditions for your whole life if you're born under favorable conditions. I would probably say that it's a system where they should expect to face fluctuations in their lifespan. And so, like for short-lived species, you can have more strict programming because the environment that an animal faces after it's born is going to be more or less fixed over their whole lives, but that's not applicable in these starlings.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That makes so much sense when you're bringing in their full life history and the variability across their entire lifetime. Thank you.
Just checking to see if there are any other questions coming in from YouTube. I don't see any currently. Does anyone in the group here have a question they want to post? Well, I may ask one, and I have to apologize in advance if I miss entirely, because as host, I'm doing 30 things back here and I don't get to hear everything. So I guess I'm just curious about, you know, in terms of load lightning, what freedoms or benefits are the mothers getting? What are they doing that could potentially enhance their condition and reproductive success?
For like future years, you're referring
to?
So the idea, I think, behind load lightning is primarily that they get to save energetic resources for future breeding attempts, and they get to avoid some of those physiological costs. But as we found out, they don't pay a ton of physiological costs. And so that partially explains in my mind why we only see incomplete load lightning. So for like every extra piece of food a helper brings, the mom doesn't stop bringing one piece of food. She might do like half that or something. And so I'm not certain exactly like what they go do with their extra load lightning time, given that they don't have a ton of costs. But I think that it plays into long-term costs. So, you know, if you imagine these tiny things that maybe I didn't get to measure in a couple years of my study accumulating over 15 years, I'm still assuming that load lightning, even a little bit at one time, is going to be a little beneficial. And I think it's just saving energetic resources.
And is it possible then that, you know, if you have load lightning and you don't have to be foraging for the kids so much, but you can go forage for yourself some more, and you may as well bring something back for the kids when you're done? Do you think that could be a scenario that's playing out? So you see them feeding the kids, but they may have additional time to feed themselves, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, they absolutely could. So I guess you're suggesting that the overall feeding provisioning or feeding rate of an animal would be the same, but they would just allocate more to themselves rather than bringing it back to the nest. Yeah, that's absolutely possible. We only measure provisioning rate by looking at the nest and counting how many times they bring something into the nest. So we don't have a ton of data on what their provisioning or foraging behavior is away from the nest. They do fly pretty far to get food before they come back, so we don't get to like see where exactly they are. So it's possible. I don't have data on what they're doing when they're not exactly at the nest.
One last question related to this. Does the quality of the resources that are brought back vary depending on whether you're helper, dad, or mom?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, and we have a little bit of information on that. So we do try to note down what type of insect prey is brought back, and I bet I can find variation in protein content or something of different prey types. And we also score how big the prey item is relative to the beak of the bird. So I don't know off the top of my head, but we could probably go back and check if there are differences in the quality or types of foods that breeders versus helpers return with.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
We have some more questions coming in. Carson, I'm going to ask Logan first, and then Clara, and then come to you. So Logan, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Logan Platt. I'm at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga as well. I remember at the beginning of your talk, you talked a little bit about anthropogenic climate change. And I was wondering how you would anticipate that may affect, like the increased extreme weather events might affect superb starlings in the future?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I'm not certain what the current predictions are for like the study site as far as like what kind of extreme weather events they might face. I think it's going to just be more droughts or more heavy rainfall. And so I would guess that those would be the main impacts that they may face, or it may be more prolonged droughts, more severe droughts. And so part of my motivation for wanting to study these starlings is because they naturally have experienced this fluctuation in their environment over time. And so seeing whether we can apply that to systems that are facing unpredictability for the first time, that are facing more extreme weather in areas of the world that typically weren't so extreme in their fluctuations. And perhaps the starlings are not the best system to try to extrapolate or predict what other species will or how other species will respond, because they have over their evolutionary histories experienced this unpredictability for so long, and they seem to do pretty fine with it. And so my original hope when I started my PhD was that this would teach us something that we can extrapolate to species facing unpredictability for the very first time. And I'm no longer so certain that that's a successful strategy, but yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I'll drop a little quick plug in for that. Thinking along that lines, Mandy Ridley is slotted to give a talk later this semester, and she this semester later in the fine this spring, and she thinks about those kinds of things with the babblers. Clara, you're next, please.
Hi. Really interesting talk. Clara Jones, Clara B. Jones, retired mammals. I'd just like to make one comment in response to a few questions that you've gotten. Theory does not predict that mothers invest as much as they can in current offspring. Theory predicts that mothers invest more or less a minimum in current and then begin to invest in future offspring. So I just wanted to make that point, because you would not necessarily expect these mothers, for example, to increase their investment as a function of variations in other parameters. And the first mention of that in the literature that I'm aware of is Trivers 1972 in the Campbell volume, but there is other work on that also.
Yeah, I bet we have enough data now also to go back and look at how these investment strategies change over age in these animals, which isn't something that we necessarily had when I started. But I do think that at this stage, we could probably compare either the offspring care investment decisions as a function of age, controlling for all those other fluctuations in environment, for example. But yeah.
Great, thanks. Really nice work.
Thank you.
I think we can probably, there's one more question from Karsten, and maybe we'll wrap it up there, so then you can have a bit of a break before your individual meetings. So Karsten, go ahead, please.
Yes, my last question is related to the survival probability you showed for females, that in larger groups are more likely to survive. And I guess this was all females, breeders and helpers, is it? So how does this relate to the probability to breed? Is the probability to become a breeder smaller in larger groups, such as the net fitness benefit might not be prevalent to, I mean, you might survive longer, but if you don't breed, it doesn't really help you evolutionarily?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my impression last I looked at this in the data set is that in bigger groups, the number of breeders is a proportion of the total group size. So if you're in a small group, you still have the same chance of breeding because the proportion of breeders is similar, even though group size is different across social groups. And I think one of the main things is you got to live long enough to get one of these possible breeding opportunities. So it is possible that if survivorship is higher in the larger groups, you may be more likely to eventually ascend to a breeding position. But I haven't looked at that. And so there's a lot of back and forth between the different social groups, not so much of breeders necessarily going back to helping, but there's a lot of the time off that individuals take. So it's really hard to classify like a breeder is always being a breeder and a helper is always being a helper. And so one thing I also really hoped I could do was tease apart survivorship of breeders versus helpers in large versus small groups. And that wasn't something we were quite able to do, but yeah, there might be some dynamics there that are hidden in the current form of the analyses.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, well, with that, I think let's all thank Sarah again. This was really a wonderful talk and a great